Stonewall Jackson knew something that no one else on either side fully understood on the morning of May 2, 1863. He knew the Union right flank lay wide open in the tangled wilderness. He knew a narrow farm road that would let 30,000 Confederates slip 12 miles around the enemy without being spotted. And he knew his men could march all day through thick brush and still slam into the Federals like a thunderbolt at sunset. That secret knowledge turned a desperate gamble into the Confederacy's greatest victory. But it also set in motion the events that would take Jackson himself from the war forever. You need to understand the moment. General Joe Hooker had crossed the Rappahannock River with nearly 70,000 men. He bragged he commanded the finest army on the planet. His plan looked perfect on paper. He would pin Robert E. Lee at Fredericksburg, while another force swept around and crushed the Confederates from behind. Lee faced impossible odds. He had only about 60,000 troops total, and they were low on everything: food, shoes, ammunition. Yet Lee refused to retreat. Instead, he made the boldest decision of his career. He split his army again. He left 15,000 men to hold the line at Fredericksburg. Then he handed the rest to Stonewall Jackson. Jackson had already earned his nickname at First Manassas. There he stood like a stone wall while the rest of the Confederate line wavered. Now at Chancellorsville, he faced the biggest test of his life. The night before the flank march, Jackson barely slept. He sent his topographical engineer, Major Jed Hotchkiss, and a local guide out into the darkness. They rode the back roads and found exactly what Jackson needed: a hidden route that skirted the Union lines. Hotchkiss came back with a rough map and the news Jackson had been waiting for. The Union right flank under General Oliver Howard sat in the air. No trenches, no cavalry screen. The Federal horsemen under Stoneman had ridden off on a raid and left the right side naked. Jackson studied the map by lantern light. He said almost nothing, but his eyes showed the fire his men knew so well. Early the next morning, Jackson climbed into the saddle. His entire Second Corps, 28,000 strong, began the march. The column stretched more than 10 miles long. They moved west, then south, then back east through the dense second-growth timber. The wilderness swallowed them whole. You could stand 10 feet from the road and never see the army passing. Jackson rode near the front. He wore his old VMI cadet cap and carried no sword. He wanted speed, not show. At one point, Union scouts spotted the dust and the long gray column. General Dan Sickles tried to hit the tail of the march. His men captured a few wagons, but Jackson kept the main force moving. He refused to stop or turn back. By early afternoon, the head of the column reached the Orange Turnpike. Jackson pulled out a pencil and scribbled a quick note to Lee. "The enemy has made a stand at Chancellor's, which is about 2 miles from Chancellorsville. I hope as soon as practicable to attack." He signed it respectfully, T.J. Jackson. Then he sealed the message and sent it back. Lee read it later and knew his gamble was working. Jackson kept pushing. He formed his 3 divisions into a giant battle line nearly 2 miles wide. Rhodes in front, Colston behind him, A.P. Hill in reserve. The men loaded their rifles in silence. They knew something big was coming, but even they did not know how big. Around 5:30 in the afternoon, the order came. Jackson raised his hand, and the line stepped off. The woods exploded with the rebel yell. 30,000 voices tore through the thickets. The Union 11th Corps never saw it coming. Most of those soldiers were German immigrants who had just sat down to supper. Some had stacked their muskets. Others played cards. Suddenly, the woods behind them filled with screaming Confederates. The attack rolled over them like a wave. Men dropped their plates and ran. Whole regiments broke without firing a shot. The 11th Corps collapsed in minutes. Jackson's men captured guns, cannons, and thousands of prisoners. They drove the Federals back more than 2 miles before darkness finally slowed them down. Jackson rode forward through the chaos. His face showed no triumph, only focus. He wanted to keep going. He believed one more hard push that night could cut Hooker off from the river crossings and end the whole campaign. He told his officers to press on. But first, he needed to see the ground ahead himself. Around 9 o'clock, he took a small party of staff officers and rode out beyond his own lines. The woods were pitch black. His men had not been told he was coming. They heard horses in the dark and thought it was Union cavalry. A single nervous voice shouted, "Halt!" Then the volley came. 3 bullets slammed into Jackson. One tore through his left arm, another ripped his right hand, the third smashed his left shoulder. He slumped in the saddle and whispered, "I am badly injured." His officers carried him back through the lines. The news spread like wildfire. Stonewall Jackson is down. Men who had cheered the victory moments earlier now stood in stunned silence. Lee received the report before dawn. He sat on a log and said quietly, "I have lost my right arm." Yet the battle was not over. Jackson had done what he set out to do. He had used the one thing he alone truly understood that morning: perfect knowledge of the ground, the enemy, and his own men's unbreakable spirit. That knowledge had changed everything at Chancellorsville, but it left the Confederacy facing its darkest question yet. Could they win without the man who had just given them their greatest day? The question now was simple. How long could the South hold out against a commander who refused to let go? The woods went dead quiet after the volley. Jackson's staff officers leaped from their horses. They lifted him down and carried him through the darkness on a litter made from blankets and fence rails. Bullets still whistled overhead. One man in the party was killed instantly. Another was wounded. Jackson stayed calm. He told them to leave him if they had to. They refused. They brought him back to a field hospital where surgeons worked by lantern light. The left arm was shattered beyond saving. The right hand was mangled. At dawn on May 3rd, they amputated the left arm just below the shoulder. Jackson woke up and asked for a drink of water. He looked at the stump and said simply, "I believe I have lost my left arm." Then he closed his eyes again. Lee got the news before sunrise. He sat on a log near the Chancellor House and spoke the words that would echo through the South. "He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm." Yet the battle still raged. Lee took personal command of the attack on May 3rd. He threw every available man at Hooker's shrinking lines. The Union commander still had more than twice as many troops. He still held strong positions. But something inside Hooker had broken. The night before, he had stood on a porch when a Confederate shell smashed the pillar beside him. The concussion knocked him senseless for a few minutes. After that, he seemed dazed. He pulled his forces back into a tight defensive circle around Chancellorsville. Lee's men charged across open fields and through burning woods. They took the high ground. They captured more guns and prisoners. By late afternoon, Hooker ordered the retreat across the Rappahannock. The Union army slipped away under cover of darkness. Chancellorsville was a stunning Confederate victory against impossible odds. Lee had done it again, but the price had just become unbearable. Jackson was moved to a small plantation house at Guinea Station. Doctors hoped the fresh air and quiet would help him heal. For 6 days, he seemed to improve. He dictated cheerful letters to his wife Anna and their newborn daughter Julia. He talked about returning to command. Then, on May 10th, the fever came. Pneumonia had set in. His mind began to wander. He called out orders to his divisions in his sleep. He thought he was still on the march. Late that afternoon, he grew calm. He looked at the ceiling and said very clearly, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." Those were his last words. He died at 6:30 in the evening. He was 39 years old. The news reached Lee's headquarters the next morning. The entire Army of Northern Virginia fell silent. Men who had charged into the jaws of death now wept openly. Lee wrote a letter to Jackson's widow that said in part, "I know not how to express my grief. He was the finest officer I ever knew." Across the South, church bells tolled. Newspapers printed black borders. Jefferson Davis called him the Confederacy's greatest loss. People who had never met Jackson felt the same stunned emptiness. Because everyone understood now what Stonewall had known that morning before the flank march. He had known the ground better than his own men. He had known the Union right flank was naked. He had known his soldiers would follow him anywhere, even through 12 miles of choking brush. That perfect knowledge of terrain, timing, and human spirit had given the South its most brilliant victory of the war. But it had also cost them the one general who could never be replaced. Chancellorsville became known as Lee's masterpiece. On paper, it looked impossible. Lee had split his army 3 times against a larger, better-supplied enemy. He had won anyway. Yet the victory carried a hidden poison. Without Jackson, the Confederacy lost its most daring corps commander. The Army of Northern Virginia would never again strike with the same lightning speed. Lee marched north into Pennsylvania 2 months later. At Gettysburg, he faced a different kind of Union commander and different kind of luck. Many historians believe the shadow of Chancellorsville hung over every decision he made. The South never recovered the offensive momentum Jackson had helped create, and the man who knew the secret of that flank march was gone forever. Today, when you look at the quiet fields around Chancellorsville, it is easy to miss what really happened there. It was not just another battle. It was the moment when one man's extraordinary knowledge of the land, the enemy, and his own troops changed the entire war for a single, dazzling day. Stonewall Jackson knew exactly what to do. He did it perfectly. And in doing it, he sealed his own fate and the Confederacy's last real chance at victory. The question he left behind still echoes. What might have happened if that nervous sentry had held his fire in the darkness on May 2nd, 1863? The answer is something the South would wonder about for the rest of its short life. The question he left behind still echoes. What might have happened if that nervous sentry had held his fire in the darkness on May 2nd, 1863? The South wondered about it for the rest of its short life, and historians still argue over it today. Because Stonewall Jackson knew more than just a hidden road and an open flank. He knew the land like the back of his hand. Thanks to Major Hotchkiss, he had studied every farm track, every stream, every patch of second-growth timber for miles around Chancellorsville. He knew exactly how far his men could march in one day without breaking down. 12 miles through brush so thick you could not see 10 yards ahead. He knew his soldiers would follow him anywhere, even on empty stomachs and worn-out shoes. Most of all, he knew the mind of the enemy. He understood that Union troops on the right flank felt safe. They had stacked their rifles. They were cooking supper. They had no cavalry screen because General Stoneman had taken the horsemen off on a useless raid. Jackson saw all of it. He turned that perfect knowledge into a hammer blow that shattered the Union 11th Corps in less than 30 minutes. You see, Jackson did not win by magic. He won because he prepared better than anyone else on the field. The night before the march, he barely slept. He pored over the rough map by lantern light. He questioned the local guide until he was sure every turn was right. When the column moved at dawn, he rode near the front. He kept the pace fast but steady. He would not let anything slow them down. Even when Union scouts spotted the dust cloud and General Sickles tried to hit the tail, Jackson refused to stop. He kept the main force moving. That single-minded focus gave the Confederacy its brightest day of the entire war. Lee split his army 3 times against a force twice its size. He trusted Jackson completely. And Jackson delivered the kind of victory people still study at military academies. In one afternoon, he captured guns, cannons, and nearly 6,000 prisoners. He rolled the Union line back more than 2 miles. Hooker, the man who had bragged about the finest army on the planet, suddenly looked lost. A shell concussion had rattled him the night before. After the flank attack, he pulled his men into a tight defensive ring and then ordered them to retreat across the river under cover of darkness. Lee had done the impossible. But the victory came at a price no one could replace. The days after the battle showed just how much Jackson had meant. Lee wrote to his widow that he had lost his right arm. The entire army of Northern Virginia went into mourning. Men who had charged into cannon fire now stood in tears when the news spread. Church bells rang across the South. Newspapers printed black borders around his picture. Jefferson Davis called the loss greater than any battlefield defeat, because everyone understood the same truth Richard Ewell had seen back in '61. Some officers were brilliant on paper, some were brave. But Jackson combined terrain knowledge, enemy psychology, and absolute trust from his troops in a way no one else matched. Without him, Lee would never again strike with the same lightning speed. 2 months later, the Army of Northern Virginia marched north into Pennsylvania. At Gettysburg, Lee faced different luck and a different Union commander. Many believe the shadow of Chancellorsville hung over every decision. The South never recovered the offensive spirit Jackson had helped create. The man who knew the secret of that flank march was gone, and the Confederacy felt it in every battle that followed. Even today, when you stand on the quiet fields around Chancellorsville, you can almost hear the rebel yell rolling through the trees. The battle lasted only a few days, yet it became known as Lee's masterpiece. On paper, it looked impossible. Lee had beaten an army twice his size with almost no supplies. But the real story is what Stonewall Jackson knew before the sun rose on May 2nd. He knew the ground. He knew his enemy. He knew his men. He turned that knowledge into one perfect afternoon of war, and in doing it, he wrote his own name into history while sealing the Confederacy's last real chance. The nervous sentry who fired in the dark that night changed more than one man's life. He changed the course of the Civil War. The South would never be the same. And the quiet professor from Virginia Military Institute became a legend the entire country still remembers. If you want more untold stories about the commanders and turning points that decided the Civil War, be sure to subscribe. New videos drop every week.